Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Charlie Munger, who's been Warren Buffett's right-hand man for the last 1,000 years. He's 96 years old, Charlie Munger.
Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah.
Incredible and still sharp as a tack, as reported. He did an interview with Jason Zweig over at Wall Street Journal describing where he is and where he thinks the American economy is. Everybody's just frozen. I would basically say we're like the captain of a ship when the worst typhoon that's ever happened comes. We just want to get through the typhoon, and we'd rather come out of it with a whole lot of liquidity. We're not playing, oh, goody, goody, everything's going to hell. Let's plunge 100% of the reserves into buying businesses. Warren Buffett wants to keep Berkshire safe for people who have 90% of their net worth invested in it. We're always going to be on the safe side. He also goes on to say about everybody just being frozen. The phone is not ringing off the hook. Everybody's just frozen in the position they're in. Nobody in America has ever seen anything like this. The thing is different. This thing is different. Everybody talks as if they know what's going to happen, and nobody knows what's going to happen.
No one.
Of course, we're having a recession. The only question is how big it's going to be and how long it's going to last. I think we do know that this will pass, but how much damage and how much recession and how long it will last, nobody knows. Although he says, I don't think we'll have a long-lasting Great Depression. I think government will be so active that we won't have one. We won't have one like that, but we may have a different kind of mess. All the money printing may start bothering us. Well, that's a very understated way to describe it. In point of fact, it'd be interesting to have a conversation with Mr. Munger about what he thinks extended the Great Depression. For more on what, just one other note too from another market expert, Alan Lands, who profited in both the 87 and 2008 crashes. The next 45 days may just become the most critical period in U.S. financial history. He suggests he's contrarian money manager, which is why he made money in those crises. Even if we execute properly, the recovery will take time, and the best case scenario is a U-shaped recovery. The much talked about V-shaped recovery is no longer in the equation because of the unprecedented combination of negatives with this crisis. Well, I'll take a U over an L. For more on what we can do to get Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett off the sidelines, as well as what letter shape the recovery will take, we're pleased to be joined by Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform. Grover, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan, good to be with you.
Well, there's things that we can do, you suggest in your piece about deregulation over at The Spectator, things we can do to try and alter or improve the shape of any projected recovery coming out of the reopening on the deregulation front. Why don't you give us a couple of examples of what you think?
Sure. One of the things that has come out of the fight with the virus is that we've learned that a lot of what the government does gets in the way of providing health care to people quickly, timely, inexpensively. We found that these laws, had them in 30-plus states, certificates of need, that if a hospital wants to add an additional bed or a X-ray machine, they have to get permission from the government and prove that they need this. You can imagine Coca-Cola having to prove that they need another bottling company, and Pepsi gets to lobby the legislature to say no. And it's become a protection racket. Unfortunately, it keeps prices high. It's the reason New York had too few beds. They wrote their own dumb rules, which gave them too few beds. They thought this was saving money, but in point of fact, you end up without the competition you need. Some states are suspending these. They should all be repealed. They keep costs up too high for nursing homes as well as hospitals. We used to have this rule for trucks. If you wanted to drive a truck from Chicago to New York, you had to go get permission from the federal government, and every one of your would-be competitors, anybody who's already in the business, got to vote about whether they liked you. They would like, no, this is not needed. We could do this. Maybe not until Thursday, but we could do it. Maybe it would cost more, but we could do it. It's not necessary. No certificate of need. We abolished all that, and trucking prices in America dropped 20% by just getting rid of the whole nest of certificate of need examples for trucking. Now we have them for hospitals. The other one is all these permits that you need to be a doctor or a registered nurse or an anesthesiologist. They don't travel easily from state to state. Healthcare and viruses and emergencies like floods, they don't operate on state lines. And their finding is doctors would move to where they were needed, or registered nurses, that they didn't have the permits. They didn't have a license. You're not a doctor in our state. You've got to go jump through some hoops. A number of states have said, okay, if you're a doctor in one state, you're a doctor in our state, at least for this emergency. Others have said, well, it'll take us 24 hours, but we'll get you the permit. What 24 hours? Can you imagine your driver's license having to be looked at for 24 hours as you cross state to state? If we want to respond quickly to a virus, we need to have seamless ability to move professionals from one state to another and still have all of their permits. I think a doctor's license in one state should be good in all 50 states. And if some states got bad licensing rules, I think that governor and legislature would be thrown out. But that's nonsense. We have all sorts of zoning rules that get in the way of working at home and home-based businesses. I don't know if people are worried you can set up a pig farm in your backyard or whatever, but it seems to me if you're not blocking traffic, the government shouldn't care whether you're sitting watching TV all day or on a computer working all day at your home. It's none of their business.
Yeah. Mr. Norquist, where does telemedicine fit in all of this?
It's a big deal. The president's ordered the federal government to start recognizing it and working with it more. I mean, telephone's been around for 100 years. Much of what you do, and now with computers, you can send your x-ray from state to state. My best friend from high school lives in Hawaii and reads x-rays in Minnesota. So in the middle of the night, if you break your arm, they don't wake up a doctor and they can come in for in an hour, to look at your x-ray. They, in fact, somebody can look at it who's awake in Hawaii, in a different state. But it's a big deal to do that. It should be seamless to do telemedicine. We are getting there, but we're just making some progress. The FDA should immediately approve any drug that's been approved by Switzerland or Germany or France or some country that does serious work in making sure the drugs are good. Japan has the policy. If the United States has approved it, we're fine. We're not going to spend a bunch of money redoing the same tests that we've already done. We don't do that. And a lot of drugs are available in Europe before they're available here because we want to spend several years looking at stuff that's competent. You could look at their study. If you think there's something wrong with their study, throw up a red flag. But if you don't see something wrong with their study, we should move forward and not have to redo the same study.
But will the deregulation come soon enough? Wall Street Journal editorial board opining yesterday, talk about irony. Our heroes in the medical professional on the front lines could be working at hospitals that are going to be pushed into bankruptcy by government policy. Oxford Economics forecasts 1.5 million quote-unquote non-essential health workers will lose their jobs this month. Mayo Clinic is cutting physician salaries by 10%. Boston Medical Center is furloughing 10% of its workforce, and so on and so forth, because all hands on deck for COVID-19 to the exclusion of hip and knee replacements, mastectomies, chemotherapy treatments, and the like. And you've fundamentally changed the viability, the economic viability of hospital systems across the country.
Yeah, I mean, for crying out loud, make part of the hospital for people with the virus, seal it off, and go to work and fix people's knees and everything else. I had an eye operation which was canceled. What was that all about? There's no reason that I think healthcare is an essential service, and people whose knees don't work should be able to get them fixed. And all hospitals need to do better on all viruses, not just this one, in terms of cleaning and keeping everything antiseptic. That's an important project line, often not paid attention to at hospitals. But, cordon it off, put it in a different room, and a different wing of the hospital. Look, there are a lot of government service fees that are imposed on businesses and workers. Let's knock that down. The idea that you have to pay the government for the right to work in your chosen profession. This is just it's a drain on getting people back to work. Those sorts of fees should be for the cost of filling out the paperwork, and that's it. There should not be ways that the government makes more money. And all doctors' licenses should be good in all 50 states, for crying out loud. I mean, there's some real The other challenge is don't raise taxes. Don't raise taxes.
Well, let's
Don't
talk
raise
about
taxes.
taxes. Let's talk about taxes. Per Charlie Munger's Charlie Munger on the sidelines and what he was saying. Steve Forbes and Art Laffer resuscitated the idea of essentially having a grace period for the FICA tax, for the payroll tax, from May 1 to the end of the year. No payroll tax to try to stimulate the recovery.
I think that's a great idea. One of the challenges you're going to have is the left has always bragged about how they take advantage of emergencies. Rahm Emanuel, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Do what you wanted to do and claim it's the crisis. When you had global cooling, they wanted to raise taxes. When it was global warming, they wanted to raise taxes. When it was climate change, they wanted to raise taxes. They just wanted to raise taxes. And each of these things where they announce there's a crisis, their solution is very, very similar. Raise taxes, hire more people, get more government to be bigger and more powerful and do more things. We have largely avoided that this time out. No permanent tax increase at the federal level, no permanent government program at the national level. And a lot of money's been spent, but it's temporary, and hopefully the damage will be temporary. But we need to make sure that when the Spanish-American War was fought in 1898, there was a tax put in, 3% tax on your phone bill. We were paying that until just a few years ago. It was more than 100 years that the Spanish-American War tax on phones, at the time only rich people had phones, but now everybody has phones. And this tax lasted 100 years, even though the war lasted 1 year. We ought not to make permanent damage with higher taxes or new government programs in reaction to a temporary crisis. And I think that's just not to do.
So then isn't this the ideal time to make the arguments for sensible tax policy that should also be permanent, whether it's related to the payroll tax or capital gains tax? I mean, if you're talking about nobody knows whether or not we're going to be in a depression, then it seems to me this is the time for big ideas and arguing case studies like the early 20s when we actually did cut taxes and tightened up the money supply to get out of the recession that provided the entree to the roaring 20s before the Depression. So this is the time to make these big arguments and put forward big ideas and fight for them, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And what you just mentioned, the recession of 1921, nobody knows about that. Why? Because the government reduced spending, cut some taxes, otherwise did nothing, right? It didn't jump and throw a bunch of money around and create programs. Lasted 18 months, and it gave you the roaring 20s. And it was by all degrees as significant a recession as the 1929 one. The difference was Hoover and FDR tried to fix that recession, and so it lasted either 10 or 20 years, depending on whether you're counting employment or the stock market coming back. But the more the government did, the lousier the economy got. And we ended up with a great long depression. So apart from trying to make whole some of the small businesses and individuals who lost their jobs, hopefully temporarily, the government should otherwise get out of the way, and that includes further rate reduction, further tax reduction, getting rid of these itty-bitty